Thank you, Mr. President, for calling this day of prayer and remembrance. We needed it at this time. When Billy Graham passed away in 2018, his children made an unexpected discovery. In his North Carolina study, tucked away in drawers and cabinets, were private writings that exposed the inner turmoil of America's most famous preacher. These journals revealed shocking truths: his crisis of faith that almost ended his ministry, the true story behind his relationship with Nixon, and confessions about his biggest regrets. The man millions knew from television wasn't telling the whole story, until now. Billy Graham was born on November 7, 1918, just before the end of World War I. He grew up on a big dairy farm near Charlotte, North Carolina. His parents, William and Mara Graham, owned a 300-acre farm with more than 70 cows. Billy's childhood was full of hard work. Every day, he had to wake up early to milk 20 cows and then do it again after school. This routine taught him discipline and a strong work ethic. When he was 15, something strange happened. After Prohibition ended, his father made him and his sister drink beer until they felt sick. This odd experience made Billy dislike alcohol for the rest of his life. As a teenager, Billy seemed like a regular kid. He was more interested in baseball and girls than anything else. But that same boy would one day preach to millions of people all over the world. By the time he was older, his sermons reached over 2 billion people through TV and radio. It's hard to believe that someone from such simple beginnings could have such a massive impact. Everything started to change when Billy was 16. In 1934, there was a revival meeting in Charlotte led by a preacher named Murray Ham. That same year, a group of local businessmen had prayed at the Graham farm, asking God to raise someone from their town to spread his message. At first, Billy didn't even want to go to the revival. He had been rejected by a local youth group for being too worldly, and he wasn't interested in religious events. But a farmhand named Albert MCM kept pushing him to go. Finally, Billy agreed. At the revival, something incredible happened. Billy didn't remember what the preacher said, but he felt deeply moved. It was like something was speaking directly to him. He felt as if his feet were heavy as he walked to the front and gave his life to Christ. This single moment changed everything for him. Billy's decision to follow Christ would eventually lead to millions of others hearing about God. Billy's journey wasn't easy, though. At 18, he went to Bob Jones College, but he struggled there. The rules were strict, and he didn't fit in. He almost got kicked out after just one semester. The school's founder even told him that he wouldn't amount to much and might only be a small-town preacher. Instead of giving up, Billy decided to transfer to Florida Bible Institute. That choice turned out to be life-changing. At the new school, Billy felt more supported. He practiced his sermons in unusual ways, preaching to birds, trees, and even alligators near a river. In 1938, something powerful happened. One night, while walking on the school's golf course, he felt torn about his future. He knelt down in the grass and told God, "I'll do whatever you want." That moment sealed his decision to dedicate his life to preaching. In 1939, at just 20 years old, Billy became a Southern Baptist minister. Even though he grew up Presbyterian, he admired the Baptist faith and chose to join it. He was baptized by immersion in a lake, which was different from the sprinkling he had as a child. His ordination showed that even at a young age, people believed in his potential to spread God's message. Billy Graham's journey to becoming one of the most famous evangelists started during World War II and the years that followed. At just 25, he gave his first Youth for Christ sermon on May 27, 1944, in Chicago. Over 2,000 people came to hear him speak. This was the beginning of something huge. Soon, he was traveling across the US, Canada, and Europe, speaking at rallies and organizing Youth for Christ chapters. In January 1945, he became the group's first full-time employee, taking on the job of planning events both nationally and internationally. Over the next 7 years, he spoke in over 300 cities, reaching thousands of people. These early years helped him become the passionate preacher people would later know. The Youth for Christ rallies were exciting and fresh. They didn't just have preaching, there was music, testimonies from celebrities, and lots of energy. These events attracted huge crowds, sometimes as many as 70,000 people. Many young people found hope in his words, especially after the hardships of war. By 1946, Youth for Christ had grown quickly, with around 300 chapters in the US and more than 200 overseas. These rallies became the start of something bigger, not just for Billy, but for other organizations like World Vision and his own Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. A turning point came with the 1949 Los Angeles Crusade. It began on September 25 under a big circus tent called the Canvas Cathedral. At first, the crowds were small, with about 3,000 people attending. But then something incredible happened. Stuart Hamm, a well-known radio host, gave his life to Christ during the event. A few days later, Louis Zamperini, a war hero and former Olympian, did the same. These moments caught the attention of media mogul William Randolph Hearst. He told his newspapers to promote Billy Graham, and suddenly, the whole country was talking about him. The crusade, which was supposed to last 3 weeks, kept going for 8 weeks. By the end, around 400,000 people had attended, and thousands made decisions for Christ. This event made Billy a household name and opened doors for more crusades across the country. In 1950, Billy knew he needed a way to organize his growing ministry. That's when the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGEA, was created. It started in a small office in Minnesota but had big goals, to share the gospel in every way possible. One of their first projects was a radio program called Hour of Decision, which began in November 1950. The program became incredibly popular and reached millions of people all over the world. Over time, the BGEA grew into a global organization, with offices in cities like London, Sydney, and Buenos Aires. They also started publishing magazines, making films, and producing TV programs. This allowed Billy's message to reach even more people. In 1948, 2 years before the BGEA was created, Billy and his team made a promise to stick to strict ethical guidelines. They were worried about scandals that had hurt other evangelists. During a meeting in Modesto, California, they came up with what they called the Modesto Manifesto. They promised to be honest about their finances, avoid even the appearance of sexual misconduct, work closely with local churches, and never exaggerate their success. This set the foundation for how Billy's ministry operated and earned the trust of millions. Billy Graham's work changed the way people shared the Christian message around the world. His crusades brought millions of people together and made him a global figure. In 1954, his first big international event in London lasted 12 weeks. Over 2 million people came to hear him speak. This was the start of his global mission, where he combined huge gatherings with media and support from local churches to reach more people than anyone had before. One of the most surprising things about Graham's work was how he united people, even in places with deep divisions. In 1973, during apartheid in South Africa, he held a crusade in Durban. More than 100,000 people attended, and Graham made sure everyone sat together regardless of race. He even called apartheid a sin, which upset the government but earned him respect around the world. In 1977, he preached in communist Hungary, where religion was often banned. Over 5 days, he spoke to more than 30,000 people. This opened the door for him to visit other communist countries, including North Korea in 1992. In 1995, Graham did something no one had ever done before. He used satellites to broadcast his message to 185 countries in 116 languages all at the same time. Over 10 million people watched, and 2.5 million responded to his message. By the time he retired, he had spoken to over 215 million people in person across 185 countries. His largest crowd was in South Korea in 1973, where 1.1 million people gathered to hear him. Beyond the numbers, his crusades changed lives. In Amsterdam in 1986, a young man struggling with drug addiction attended one of his events and became a Christian leader in the Netherlands. Graham wasn't just about live events, he used media to reach even more people. His radio program Hour of Decision started in 1950. Within a year, it was on 150 stations, and by 1954, it was on 800 worldwide. He preferred live broadcasts because he thought they felt more real to listeners. On TV, he made a huge impact too. In 1957, his New York crusade aired on ABC for 16 weeks. It reached 96 million viewers, about 70% of all households with a TV at the time. People were so interested that ABC's phone lines jammed with calls on the first night. In 1981, Graham reached 50 million people across Africa through a satellite broadcast. It was the first time many Africans had seen such an event. His team even had to fly in generators to power equipment in remote areas. Graham also wrote a newspaper column called My Answer, which appeared in hundreds of newspapers and reached 5 million readers. Even in his later years, he embraced new technology. In 1989, he started one of the first Christian websites where people could chat with counselors about spiritual questions. By 2008, his online ministry was helping over 1.5 million people every year. In 1956, Graham launched Christianity Today, a magazine that became a major voice for evangelicals. The idea came to him in the middle of the night, and he stayed up writing down his vision for the magazine. He and his team raised a large sum of money to start it and sent free copies of the first issue to Protestant pastors across America. The magazine quickly became popular and tackled big issues like civil rights and the Vietnam War. Despite money problems in the beginning, it grew into one of the most respected religious publications. Billy Graham's life completely changed in 1949 when he faced something that shook his faith. He was 30 years old and already becoming a popular preacher, but he started having doubts about the Bible. This was strange for him because he had grown up believing in the Bible without question. His friend Charles Templeton, who had been studying at Princeton, was one reason these doubts started. Templeton was questioning how the Bible could fit with modern ideas. This made Graham think too, and he began to wonder if he could trust the Bible fully. This was a big problem because his most important event, the Los Angeles Crusade, was just a few weeks away. If he didn't trust the Bible completely, how could he preach with confidence? Graham felt lost and unsure. He knew he needed answers, so he went to Forest Home, a quiet Christian retreat in the mountains of California. He hoped being there would help him figure things out. At the retreat, Graham talked to Henrietta Mears, a wise Christian teacher, and others who gave him advice. They told him that losing faith in the Bible could lead to losing faith in everything else. They encouraged him to ask God for help. One evening, Graham went for a walk alone in the woods at Forest Home. He stopped by a tree stump, placed his Bible on it, and began to pray. He told God he didn't have all the answers, but decided to trust the Bible by faith. He prayed, "I'm going to believe this is your word even if I don't understand everything." After this moment, Graham felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. He said he felt God's presence so clearly that it brought him to tears. This was the turning point for him. When the Los Angeles Crusade started on September 25, 1949, Graham was a completely different preacher. He spoke with confidence and energy, often starting his messages with "the Bible says." People could feel how deeply he believed what he was saying. The crusade was supposed to last 3 weeks but was extended to 8 weeks because so many people came to hear him. Over 35,000 people attended, and 3,000 decided to follow Christ. A newspaper owner, William Randolph Hearst, even told his editors to promote Graham, which made him famous all over the country. From that moment, Graham never looked back. He became one of the greatest evangelists in history. Over his lifetime, he preached to more than 215 million people in 185 countries. His largest crowd was in South Korea, where 1.1 million people came to hear him. His simple style and focus on the Bible helped millions of people understand and believe. That night by the tree stump in Forest Home didn't just change Billy Graham's life, it changed the course of history for evangelical Christianity. Billy Graham was close to many U.S. presidents, but his bond with Richard Nixon stood out. He first met Nixon in the 1950s when Nixon was a senator, and over time, they became very close. By 1968, Graham was so involved in Nixon's campaign that he wrote memos and gave advice on how to win support from evangelical voters. He wasn't just a spiritual advisor, he was part of the political strategy. From 1969 to 1974, Graham visited the White House 30 times. Sometimes he even stayed overnight. He prayed at Nixon's 1969 inauguration, calling him a leader chosen by God, and gave advice on big issues like the Vietnam War. In one shocking moment, Graham even suggested bombing dikes in North Vietnam if peace talks failed. That could have killed many civilians, but it showed how far his involvement went. Even during the Watergate scandal, Graham stayed loyal to Nixon. He defended him publicly and refused to believe Nixon had done anything wrong. But when the truth came out in the White House tapes, Graham was devastated. He read the transcripts in 1974 and couldn't believe Nixon's lies. It hit him so hard that he cried and even threw up. This betrayal made Graham rethink how deeply he had gotten involved in politics. In 2002, another part of Graham's past caused a scandal. Tapes from 1972 revealed a conversation between Graham and Nixon where they made anti-Semitic comments. Nixon complained about Jewish control of the media, and Graham agreed, saying it was a problem that needed to be fixed. He even admitted that while many Jewish people were friendly to him, they didn't know how he really felt. When the tapes were released decades later, people were shocked. Graham, who was 83 at the time, said he didn't remember the conversation but apologized, saying his words didn't match his love for Jewish people. Still, the incident hurt his reputation as someone who brought people together. As Graham grew older, he admitted he had made mistakes. In a 2011 interview, he said he regretted getting so involved in politics. He felt it was important to guide leaders spiritually, but he also believed he had crossed the line. Watergate had been a wake-up call for him. When he realized Nixon had lied, it changed how he saw politics forever. He later warned against mixing religion and politics too much. In 1981, he even said he didn't want to see religious groups being used by politicians because it could harm both faith and the country. One of Graham's most controversial moments came after Nixon resigned in 1974. Graham pushed President Gerald Ford to pardon Nixon, saying it was the best way to help the country move on. He called Nixon to comfort him and then spoke to Ford, urging him to make the decision. Graham also defended the pardon in public, saying it was necessary for healing. When Ford finally pardoned Nixon, many people were angry, but Graham stood by his belief that it was the right thing to do. Graham's influence on presidents was powerful, but it also showed the risks of being so close to political power. He thought he was helping, but sometimes his actions blurred the line between faith and politics. While some admired his efforts, others criticized him for getting too involved. These moments are part of his complicated legacy. White supporters, but he didn't back down. From that point on, he made sure all his crusades had integrated seating, even in the deeply segregated South. In 1957, at a crusade in New York City, Graham noticed most of the audience was white. He asked for advice from Howard Jones, a black pastor. Jones told him to bring his message to Harlem. Graham followed this advice and held rallies in Harlem and Brooklyn. These events brought thousands of black attendees, changing the crowds at his crusades. But not everyone was happy about this. Graham received hateful messages from segregationists who called him slurs. In 1964, just after a tragic church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, Graham held an integrated crusade there. Protesters vandalized billboards advertising the event, and police had to protect him. Even though Graham fought for integration at his events, many people criticized him for not doing more during the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders used protests and direct action to fight racism. Graham, however, avoided these methods. When King was arrested in 1960 for a sit-in, Graham said people should follow the law, even if it was unjust. Civil rights leaders were upset by this because they believed bad laws had to be challenged. Graham thought the best way to solve racism was by changing people's hearts through faith. He often said that both black and white people needed a personal relationship with Jesus to overcome racism. But this approach didn't address the bigger issue of systemic injustice, and many felt it wasn't enough. During the height of the civil rights movement, Graham stayed quiet on many key events. In 1963, peaceful protesters in Birmingham were attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. Graham didn't say much about it. He also didn't attend the March on Washington, where King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Instead, he said things like, "Only when Christ comes again will white and black children walk hand in hand." To some, this sounded like he didn't believe people could make change happen in the present. Graham's hesitation to fully support the civil rights movement was partly because of his ties to political leaders, including segregationists. In 1965, during the Selma voting rights campaign, Graham criticized the protesters for their tactics, saying, "I don't condone violence. It's not the best way." This upset civil rights leaders who believed nonviolent protests were necessary for change. Graham and King had a complicated relationship. In 1957, Graham invited King to pray at his New York crusade. King's prayer called for unity and brotherhood, and he later praised Graham for addressing race issues. But their relationship grew tense. In 1958, King urged Graham not to let a segregationist politician introduce him at a crusade in Texas. Graham ignored this advice, saying he didn't get involved in politics. Later, Graham claimed King told him to stay in stadiums and influence white audiences instead of joining protests. However, there's no proof this conversation ever happened, and some scholars doubt it. Graham's actions on race were often inconsistent. He demanded integrated seating at his events but allowed segregated choirs at times. In 1965, after the violence in Selma, he preached in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, saying, "I'm not here to talk about local issues, just the gospel." Many saw this as avoiding the hard truths about racism. In a 1960 article, he wrote that forced integration wouldn't work because you can't make people love each other by force. While he fought for some change, his words often seemed to defend the status quo. Later in life, Graham admitted he could have done more. In 1989, he said, "I wish I had done more for civil rights when I was younger." Some praised his honesty, but others wondered why someone with his influence hadn't taken a stronger stand. Billy Graham's life was full of love, challenges, and faith that inspired millions. His marriage to Ruth Bell Graham was like a storybook romance. They first met at Wheaton College in 1940 when Billy was working on a furniture truck and saw Ruth for the first time. It took him an entire month to build up the courage to ask her out. Their first date was to listen to Handel's Messiah on December 15, 1940. Ruth had always dreamed of becoming a missionary in Tibet, but she felt God had a different plan for her life. After praying and thinking about it, she decided to marry Billy, believing she could support his work for God's mission in her own way. They got married on August 13, 1943, 2 months after graduating from Wheaton College. Their marriage lasted for 63 years, ending only when Ruth passed away in 2007. Even though Billy traveled a lot for his ministry, they stayed connected with daily phone calls when apart and prayed together every night when they were together. Ruth once said, "I'd rather have a little of Bill than a lot of any other man," showing how much she supported and loved him. They had their share of disagreements too. When Billy told Ruth she couldn't drive after wrecking their car, she teased him by saying, "Abraham didn't take Sarah's camel away." Billy always said Ruth was the strongest influence in his life and the foundation of their family. Billy's beliefs about Christianity also changed as he grew older. At first, he followed strict fundamentalist teachings, but he started to see things differently. He decided to open his ministry to include people from different Christian backgrounds. In the late 1940s and 1950s, he chose to work with mainline Protestant churches and even Catholic groups. This decision upset some of his early supporters, but it allowed him to reach more people. By the 1960s, his events were drawing huge crowds, sometimes over 100,000 people. Billy wanted to share the message of Jesus with as many people as possible. He believed the Bible was inspired by God but didn't agree with very rigid interpretations. In 1964, he even met with Pope Paul VI, which surprised many of his Protestant followers. Graham later worked with Catholic leaders at his events and encouraged Catholics to return to their local churches. Some of his views caused debates, like when he said people who didn't know Jesus directly might still find salvation if they followed the light they had in their hearts. These ideas made some evangelical leaders criticize him, but Billy always stayed focused on sharing God's love with everyone. Billy also had clear views on social issues, but he handled them with care. He believed life started at conception and spoke out against abortion after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. However, he didn't use harsh words or get overly political. He wanted to offer kindness and understanding. On same-sex marriage, he believed in the traditional idea of marriage between a man and a woman. In 2012, when he was 93 years old, he even paid for newspaper ads supporting this view. But he never condemned others. He once said, "We don't have a right to preach against everything we don't agree with," showing his belief in compassion over judgment. In his later years, Billy faced many health struggles but stayed strong in his faith. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1992, which made it hard for him to move and speak. Over time, he also had prostate cancer and hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the brain. Despite surgeries and treatments, he continued his ministry for as long as he could. By the time he was in his 90s, his hearing and eyesight became very poor, but his mind stayed sharp. In his book Nearing Home, he wrote about aging and preparing for death, saying his faith gave him peace. Billy's last big public event was his 95th birthday in 2013. After that, he stayed at home in Montreat, North Carolina, with his family and caregivers. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 99, leaving behind a legacy of love, faith, and a message that reached millions.